trying to get the caption. Oh, we seem to be live now, but without Elgin.
Okay, there.
And I'm not sure what's happened to Elgin at the moment. Do I need to start doing the intro without Elgin?
He just dropped off the screen.
Well, I suppose one can say welcome to today's Global Christian Perspectives. My name's Chris Eyre from the right-hand side of the Atlantic, and with me at the moment is Dr. Tony Mitchell from the left-hand side, and hopefully sometime in the near future, my co-host Elgin Hushbeck, also from the left-hand side, but the right-hand side of everything else.
I was going to say, you keep pushing. He's further left than I am, but he ain't going to like that.
I get away with it when he's not on air.
Yeah.
Do we give him a few more moments, or do we just launch in, I wonder? Well, I think we launch in. I have from the news a set of articles that some of which I popped through to Elgin, and one at least of which Elgin added himself. The issue of immigration. Elgin says not just a US problem, and it is growing. Certainly, there are a lot of reports in the UK media about apparently fairly substantially increased number of migrants coming into Europe across the Mediterranean to Italy, across the Mediterranean from Turkey to Greece, and from the east. And the issue is really whether we are just being lacking in compassion in not welcoming them with open arms at the moment. I've seen an article yesterday which suggested that the whole problem really was that Europe lacks compassion, and if Europe lacks compassion, Britain particularly lacks compassion at the moment, because we have a lot less of the refugees than most of the rest of Europe, Germany being the largest recipient at present.
Okay,
And I think we can now welcome Elgin back.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. I pressed go live, and then it told me my computer went to sleep, although it didn't. So
okay, well, I have got as far as introducing myself and the topic. So, okay. Elgin, would you like to come in and give some of your thoughts on the matter?
Well, I see this as just one of those days, isn't it? Hold on. There. Never ends. I see immigration as basically seems to be a growing problem, and for me the symptom is what's driving much of it is instability in the world. That whether we're causing it, allowing it, we can have that debate in a little bit, I guess. But it seems that the mass immigration is being driven by either political or economic instability, and that the real solution to it is going to be found in addressing those particular problems rather than focusing on the massive wave of immigration itself.
Mm-hmm. I'm getting the argument of you on
that. I was mentioning just before you came on an article recently, particularly attacking the UK as lacking compassion, and arguing that the vast bulk of the migrants who want to come into Europe at the moment are actually fleeing war-torn areas. And to be fair, you are looking at Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea, and Nigeria as the main sources for those. Nigeria, of course, has the Boko Haram.
Yeah, I think you could throw Libya in there as well.
Yes, I suspect you probably can, but so far there don't actually seem to be a vast number of migrants who actually originate in Libya, though an awful lot of African ones come through Libya, because Libya has no effective controls on movement at the moment because of the political situation there.
Yeah.
As I see it, things are perhaps a bit different in the States, because I don't know if I'm wrong, but I see most of yours as being economic migrants.
Yes.
Yeah.
They made claims about, war-torn Central America, but that strikes me as more of an excuse to claim asylum, because they know if you come across and you claim asylum, you get to stay, and I think that's probably more of an excuse than an actual reason. I think economics is driving it.
Well, Guatemala right now, Guatemala's in. I haven't quite figured out what's going on in Guatemala, but they're getting ready to impeach the president. So the stability of Guatemala, the political stability of the whole country is in question.
Yeah.
But
Political instability and the threat of actually being killed because of a war-torn area, I think what's really driving Central. They're politically unstable, but the big driver is economic.
Yeah, I'm not. That it's a very interesting conundrum. All the immigrants are coming because they seek a better employment status here, and all of our companies seem to be moving our work back that way, which I haven't quite figured out. Who's gaining? Someone's gaining in this. If the workers are coming here, but the work is going there, that's not. There's a problem there.
Well, I think a big problem, at least in terms of Central and South America, is the corruption factor. It's hard to have a strong economic growth if you have corruption. And establishing the rule of law and clear guidelines for businesses to operate in is critical, and it doesn't exist. There's a lot of graft. There's a lot of just under the table dealing, so to speak, and that makes it difficult for businesses to thrive. Although they are trying to go down there, and I see that as a good thing, because developing the economy in those countries will take the pressure off the illegal immigration. I mean, we don't have much of a illegal immigration problem from Canada. It exists, but it's not quite the same problem as from say, Mexican population in the United States.
No, and ours all seem to come from a lot further east or a lot further south. Though in this country, our main immigrant population these days is from the Eastern European countries that have now become part of Europe, which gives us the problem that we cannot actually deny them entry to the country, because we are signed up to treaties guaranteeing the free movement of labour. So we have around 2 million Eastern European workers here at the moment, which is slightly more than the number of unemployed people we have in the country. Some people make an equation between the two, but very largely there isn't a match, because the Eastern Europeans are doing jobs that those who are unemployed either won't or can't do. Those I don't see an easy answer to. My difficulty is with the very substantial, genuine refugee population, and we are taking almost none of them here. Germany has, I think, over 1 million. We have 9,000, maybe. I think we are completely lacking in compassion, and I think that is enjoined on us as Christians. So.
One of us has got a kid loose.
It's not me.
I was wondering, Chris, is part of the compassion issue in Britain a carryover from the really old days of the empire? Because you're saying right now most of the immigrants that they're trying to get into England are Eastern European.
Yeah.
And I know you have an Indian and Pakistani population.
We do.
In Britain. That probably have some ties back to the quote, the good old days, to the colonial times.
Indeed so.
And so therefore, there, I don't know, I'm just speculating as to, you're talking about the lack of compassion, and then, maybe it's just the change in who's coming in.
The Eastern Europeans look like us, and quite a few of them talk like us as well, which of course tends not to be the case with anybody from the Middle East, Africa, or further east than that. There is significant prejudice based on the colour of people's skin and the way they look here, but it's not nearly as bad as it was when I was growing up. I don't think the main driver is actually at the moment that, but then I live in an area of the country which is hugely white, so I don't see a great deal of the tensions that may be going on in the larger cities.
By the way, I do want to mention that I do have the question and answer app up and running, so if anybody has a question, be free to submit it to us. We'll try to get to it. Well, we're going to be coming back to this topic, at least a form of it, in the in-depth discussion part today. So let's switch over to our other topic, which is somewhat related. We had the huge stock market crash. And at least in the United States, a lot of the immigration issue is driven by economic factors. So one of the questions I have is how much of this is being driven by poor government, and how much of this is just the normal dynamics of a marketplace, and should we be concerned about it?
Well, if I understand, the problems in the United States stock market always seem to wake up or carry over from China. And my understanding is the Chinese government is trying to manipulate or fiddle with the Chinese stock market, and they're causing people to pull out in droves. That was my understanding of the earlier this week. That caused the drop, which then shows up in the U.S. stock market because we're reacting to what, the disadvantage of the international date line. They're already done. And we're responding to what they've done.
Yeah.
And, I chuckle when you said bad government because the Chinese communists are doing capitalism at its worst.
Well, actually, when you try to merge two systems, as an engineer by training, I oftentimes, when you try to merge two systems together, you oftentimes don't get the best of both, you get the worst of both. But, yeah. Chris, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I do remember making what was probably a more prescient prediction than I actually thought at the time. When the UK gave Hong Kong back to China, I said, so we are allowing Hong Kong to take over China. Which actually was, in terms of size of economy, the way it was working at that point. And certainly it seems to be the way that their economy has started working. So we have the Hong Kong financial system, which was almost completely unregulated and was always very, very volatile, with the Chinese communists doing the social side of things, which, frankly, I think is almost totally the wrong way round.
Yeah. I would agree with that in a large extent. I mean, you have, I think what's behind both China and a lot of the problems is even though I agree with Tony that the current swings were driven, I think the market was ready for a swing, and China just was the excuse to do what it wanted to do anyway, which was pull back and then regroup and then move forward again. But I think a large part of all of this is being driven by the whole issue of debt. I know it's a large part of behind China problems is they have a lot of debt. They have raised their debt level significantly, and with their slowing economy, there's some question about whether they'll be able to pay off their debt. And that's what's causing the instability there. I think it's also causing some of the problems here. And, of course, we've seen Greece and some of the European countries. So how much of this is sort of dragging down the whole system?
I don't like the way the markets operate myself. People try to second guess what the market will be doing tomorrow. So they act now in anticipation of what they think might be happening tomorrow. Other people second guess what those people will be doing today and try to do it yesterday. And the result is that the whole thing becomes massively more volatile than there is any base cause for. As I said, the Hong Kong markets, when Hong Kong was entirely separate, were notoriously volatile. Gambling on their stock market was way out of the league of anything that happened on our stock market back in the day, and their gains and losses were correspondingly huge. But now they've got an economy the size of China's to operate that way on. I think the markets are not sufficiently regulated.
Lost Elgin.
Oh, rats. And you're probably not going to disagree with me on that, but he is.
I'm the only thing I have never had the resources to do more than think about the stock market.
Uh-huh.
I did have funds available at one time, but the models that I was following required just put it in, leave it alone, and let it ride.
Yes.
And
I think that's the only way any normal private investor can do it.
yeah,
Unless you spend your entire life reading the financials and trying to work out what the financial papers are going to say next week, which some do.
yeah. Well, that was the thing. Is a couple things that we did. My father, my godfather was actually a stockbroker.
Uh-huh.
And one time I was in Washington, D.C., which is where his office was. And I called. Hi, I'd like to speak to my godfather. Oh, he had in the office in 20 years. He got into mutual funds in the 50s.
Right.
He got everybody into mutual funds, set them all up, and then he just called. He was telecommuting to his office from rural Virginia in the mid '50s.
Oh, wonderful!
And they said, yeah, he hasn't been in the office. When I called in '64, he hadn't been in the office in 10 years because he didn't need to. But he had everybody set up. And then when I started thinking about the stock market, I was looking at the computers. Mm-hmm. And what you see now with all of the E-Trade, and I don't know what it's like, UK, but we have all these online computer programs. 1 second, I'm gonna shout over your head, Chris, to my wife who's sitting out on the porch. What's Meech do? Her grandson, my wife's oldest grandson. That's what he does. He's playing the market with computers and foreign trade and foreign currency. He's playing for the gap. Yeah. That's the only difference. The nice thing, so when I heard Monday, that the Chinese market was going to be dropping, I knew the only thing I knew was if it goes that bad on Wall Street, they got circuit breakers that are supposed to kick in and at least slow it down. Without that, we'd have 1920. We'd probably have 1929 all over again.
Absolutely.
And we almost had back in the late 90s. We almost had that.
Yes.
Before they started putting the breakers in.
Yes, indeed so. I still feel it's under-regulated from that point of view, and that there's far too much gambling and far too little buying stocks on the basis of what the underlying companies are really worth.
I don't know if it's too little regulated, but it's probably regulated in the wrong direction, where we encourage short-term profits. I know one of the things that have gone in where in the 90s, we were very concerned about CEO profits, and so we put in a bunch of new regulations to basically pay based on performance, which they did. But what that's actually done is it's allowed CEOs to make even vastly more sums of money because they're now paid based on the stock price, and they're looked at. And they every morning, CEO nowadays routinely comes in, first thing he does is checks the stock price, because that's what they're going to get paid on, that's what they're going to get judged on, and it encourages a very short-term thinking as opposed to more long-term strategies, which would be more helpful.
I was thinking, while you were struggling with the connection, Chris, the one thing I meant, or to Elgin, the one thing I mentioned to Chris was what I was taught when back in the 90s was put it in and let it ride. And I was looking at models that basically you did a long term. The other thing that we did with the grandkids 15 years ago is we all bought was a Walt Disney, partially because the stock certificate's a work of art. But they all, and we put in a little bit, and Disney stock, whatever it's called now, because it's not Disney stock anymore, but it was what's called a DRIP, dividend reinvestment. We didn't touch it, and the one grandson's got I think I put $200 in. He's got $1,500 sitting there, no activity other than just the yearly dividend. And that's, well, we don't, like you said, Elgin, we're more concerned with the short term than the long term.
Yeah.
And,
I agree.
And a large part of that's driven by government policy and the way they judge things, whereas it's not so much, I think, that government shouldn't be. I don't believe I'm not a libertarian. I don't believe in completely standing off, but I'm much more concerned about the micromanaging and saying, oh, you shouldn't be allowed to do this or shouldn't be allowed to do that is, a lot of that is, for example, it's basically insurance. people, whenever oil prices go up, people complain about the oil price speculators, so to speak. But what they're really doing is they're selling long-term contracts, betting on what oil will be in the future. And a lot of, for example, airlines will buy those because they know that they can then set out a business model and not be concerned about oil prices. And sometimes it'll end up meaning they'll pay a little bit more for oil price, or sometimes prices will go up and they'll pay less. But that's how they ensure their long-term health in the market. So some of these strategies are very important, but government oftentimes messes things up considerably.
The concept behind futures is fine. The trouble is, futures go up and down just like stocks do, on the basis of what somebody thinks somebody else is going to think somebody else is going to think a few days in the future. It becomes hugely volatile, and people gamble on it, and that is not doing any good for the underlying producers or consumers. It is merely a form of gambling, and the way we have things set up encourages that, and I don't think it should.
No, and there's ways to, for example, having tax policy based on how long an investment is held, right, as opposed to encouraging short-term investment, things like that. But anyway, closing comments on this topic before we move on.
Well, I'm going to go back to a comment. I remember the international dateline. It's tomorrow in Tokyo, so if we could know what Tokyo's doing, Chris is catching on. If you know what Tokyo's doing, it'd be nice if we could do that a little more accurately. Know what happens tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if we all could go back in the future or in the past and buy stock for today,
Yeah, that was my other option, was Back to the Future, the plot where he took the magazine and on the...
I have nothing more.
Okay. All right, well, we're at the bottom of the hour. Hopefully I'll stay around long enough. I've been having internet problems for some reason. But we're to transition, so take a few minutes or a minute to introduce yourself and give a chance or a blog post. So, Chris?
Well, my name's Chris Eyre. I'm one of the Energian editors, and I blog at airlines, E-Y-R-E, lines.energian.net. That's me.
Okay, Tony?
Okay, I'm Tony Mitchell. I've been working on a project for Henry, the publisher, for a couple years now, and struggling to get it through. I'm in the first 30 seconds of the universe in my studies. I blog at Thoughts on the Heart from the Left. Thoughts of the Heart on the Left, I'm sorry. And there goes Elgin again.
I think we have.
I just had an alarm go.
And
I'm back. I just had an alarm go off.
Okay. Elgin has a number of published books to his name, not all of which I recall, but Preserving Democracy and What's Wrong with the Social Gospel are the two that I actually have. And he blogs, and I haven't the faintest idea what the address of that is off the top of my head.
What was that one about the gospel?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
What was the name of that one, that second book you said?
What's Wrong with the Social Gospel?
Oh, okay, Social Gospel.
Social Gospel.
Nothing.
You may gather that that's one on which I don't agree with Elgin at all, but with him not here, it would be entirely unfair to go into that further. I have on my list Energian Direct Prize announcement, but I have no details of what that is, so I'm going to have to leave that to Elgin to announce when he gets back. Do we want to move on to the second segment here, Tony?
Might as well.
Which is, who is our neighbour? And Elgin says, a large part of the reason for the immigration problems are economic problems, corrupt governments, instability and wars around the world. What is our responsibility to those who are suffering around the world? And he says, some background. Former President Clinton has said many times in the years since that not intervening in Rwanda is his greatest regret. In March of this year, he told CNBC that he believes had the US gone into Rwanda, even marginally, early on in the genocide, at least a third of the hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered could have been saved. Have you any immediate feelings on that, Tony?
Well, one thing that I can recall is the criticisms for not doing anything in Africa.
Hmm.
You know, that I think part of, at the time that was going on, I know part of my lack of knowledge was I was getting up at 4 a.m. for a commute.
Mm-hmm.
So I was well out of any, and at that time Wi-Fi's didn't exist, but even if they had, I would have still been asleep.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very difficult to follow the case. But the criticism was we were doing things in Bosnia, we were interceding in Bosnia, but we weren't doing anything in Africa. And we're sort of giving we were more Eurocentric than we should have been. And this tends to, for me, this tends to be the case. Here in this country, Donald Trump is, for the lack of a better term, he's Lance to Boyle. He's opened up a discussion, rightly or wrongly, that, as you mentioned earlier, there's still there's racism. Oh, what the heck! It's a racism topic, and it seems to be taking place. It's the same thing going on in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Anne's getting ready. Anne's been working on a project of personal interest about the Holocaust, and we just finished watching a show about the Nuremberg trials. And Justice Jackson, who led the court, was saying, if we do this, we can effectively eliminate Nazism. And of course, the day after we watched that was the day the neoconservatives burned that gym in Germany.
Yeah.
Now, my neighbor doesn't necessarily look like me. And the question that Chris posed, who is my neighbor, that's been a question that's been around for 2,000 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's why I phrased it. Now I'm back. Before I leave again, I hope I got my internet connection problem. I'm getting some echo. Hold on. Let me see if I can.
You're fine on my part.
Yeah, I just lost everything again. Okay, let me. Hopefully you can hear me. Let me announce the book winner. First off, I'm Elgin Hushbeck, and I blog at hushbeck.com, and I have several books out that you can find at my website. But Henry, our publisher and sponsors this, has been having a contest over at the Energion discussion group, and this week's winner of a book is Barbara for her comment, which is number 32797. And for winning that, she's going to receive her choice of a book, either Why Christians Should Care About Their Jewish Roots by Nancy Petray, Jewish Roots Journey by Nancy Petray, or she can choose A Home United Participatory Study by Bob LaRochelle. So congratulations to Barbara, and you can enter the contest by going over to energion.discuss and getting involved in the discussion.
Yeah. Congratulations.
And hopefully I got through that without my connection dropping off again.
You did indeed.
Okay. I raised the question of who is our neighbor because of that very issue. There's a growing movement, I think, within the United States, and particularly among conservatives, to take the idea that we should basically only be concerned about our country. This is probably best put out by Ron Paul and Rand Paul, but we shouldn't be concerned with what happens overseas. Let them take care of themselves. We will be concerned with what happens here at home. And my view is I think we're seeing the results of that in other countries around the world. It's part of the reason for the immigration problem we talked about in the first section. Is as the United States pulls back, you get instability around the world, and we don't like the phrase "the world's policeman," but in some respects, that's what we've been. And now that we're pulling back from it, we see that the less savory forces are beginning to dominate and cause problems. So that was kind of the background I had for this story, and of course it was President Clinton's, regrets about Rwanda. I think it's also got us involved in Somalia. Will cause the problems in Somalia. With that there was comments about what was going on in Somalia and why were we doing anything there. So I think that put pressure to send troops into Somalia, and of course that ended up the way it did. So with Black Hawk Down and that story. So that's kind of the background that I was thinking on. What is our when we see problems around the world, Christians being slaughtered in many African states, women being sold into slavery in under ISIS, and of course the horrible crimes that are occurring. What is our obligation, if any, to do something about it?
I see there as being two issues here. One is the duty to look after refugees where they are legitimately refugees, and on that front I think throughout the Bible we have a responsibility to look after people in that situation, people who are sojourners in the country in the Old Testament. Whether we should then say, come and settle here permanently, or whether we should say, yes, come and stay here until things are safe and then go back home, is another issue, and I don't think there's a clear answer on that. As far as who is our neighbour, anybody is our neighbour, and I think the biblical witness, including Samaritans, the Syrophoenician woman, etc., indicates that the person we ought to be identifying as our neighbour is probably the one that we don't like, we don't trust, who have the wrong religion, the wrong politics, the wrong skin colour, and are, generally speaking, lousy people. But they're still our neighbour. As far as the issue of being global peacekeeper is concerned, I lean towards the pacifist at the best of times. I am very reluctant to think about intervening in wars somewhere else. But I'm not quite 100% with the Mennonites on that yet. But what I most see is that our recent attempts to intervene in wars elsewhere and bring peace to somewhere have not, at the end of the day, actually brought peace there. I think peacekeeping is only effective insofar as you can keep boots on the ground there, possibly for the indefinite future. And I don't know whether the States has the resources or the will to do that, but I'm pretty certain my country doesn't anymore.
I was going to. My comment would be, if you can do nothing, which is what this country, the United States, tried to do prior to World War I. And then once you get in it, you're committed to the finish. Whatever, as you just said, Chris, whatever the finish is, you just can't say, okay, we've been in. Unfortunately, we've said we've been in for 10 years. We're going to leave it, and the other side of the coin is when we're going to be our neighbor, or when we're going to look at our neighbor, we try to make our neighbor look like us. We don't understand what they're doing. There always pops up 10 things. One of those things that pops up: 10 things not to do when you travel abroad. There's certain things that there's at the risk of making a bad joke, it's order a cold beer in England. I don't drink beer, so I wouldn't order a beer anyway. But
yes.
Actually, a better one would be to understand what a bonnet is. This was a discussion I had in graduate school. One guy came to the lunch table, was faculty, and he said he didn't believe that a person was actually an Englishman, and he had an English auto mechanics repair book. So he was asking him automotive terms, and a bonnet is the trunk, the hood.
The hood, generally, to you.
Yeah. So if you don't know your neighbor's terms, you can't be a good neighbor with them. And we tend to go in, make it sound like make it our place, and expect them to pick that right up.
Yeah.
And like Chris said, I'm sorry, I'm thinking Elgin, and I'm seeing Chris's name right next to it, which means I'll call Chris Energon. Chris said earlier we never, I'm not arguing that we accept corruption, but if we don't understand that there's corruption in play where we're going in to do work, if we're going to assume this is the way it's done, and we're using an American business model, and we're working with I believe the term in India is bakshish, the payment. If we don't understand we're dealing with that, we got to get rid of it. But if we don't understand it, we're not gonna have a very good result.
Yeah.
In the comment.
Yeah. My view is we should be very reluctant to go in and change, but once we do, we should finish it. I think one of the problems we're seeing now is both in Libya and in Iraq is we had stabilized Iraq and then we pulled everybody out. And like I said, the model I mentioned before, compare that to Korea, where we're still in Korea, and Korea is a first world country now. And the same thing happened in Libya. There, we never even went in. We just basically bombed from the distance and thought maybe once Gaddafi was dead, it would take care of itself, which I think was very unrealistic. So we seem to want to do, I don't think you can do half measures, but it is a very difficult problem. When do you go in and when do you not? And what's worth intervening and what's worth, standing back and having sort of like the Star Trek Prime Directive where we don't get involved. Difficult. These are not very easy questions. I think the easiest question of all is who's our neighbor. I agree with Chris. Everyone's our neighbor.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to get any argument from me. I think the thing is with Iraq, and just, I was thinking as you were saying that, we presume that taking out the hostile government, whether we're talking about Iraq or whether we're talking about Libya, and I can remember, I can recall thinking at the time when the Soviet Union broke apart, and now democracy is taking place in Russia. They don't have a model. There's no, they don't have a, they don't have a model for democracy, and we assume that it's just going to be naturally picked up.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my greatest, I had, maybe it was because I was watching a couple movies, Soviet Union getting a very nationalistic leader. That was a fear I personally had when the Soviet Union broke up, is that Russia would get somebody very, very nationalistic. And there's a history of, when you get nationalistic leaders, you get some very interesting history.
Well, it goes all the way back to Plato. Plato warned about the strong leader would come up, rally the masses, and basically become a dictator. That was his big complaint with democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a history of certainly states around the south and east of the Mediterranean that are democratic and democratically vote not to be anymore. And there just is not the tradition there that is going to sustain the kind of democracy we might like to see. And I have to wonder whether, for them, democracy is something which we should be trying to foist on them.
Well, we even got to define what we mean by democracy, because what we refer to as democracy on this side of the pond is not what you defined as democracy.
We both operate representative democracies. The major difference is that you have an elected president, and the nearest equivalent we have to that is the Prime Minister, who is the leader of the largest party in our main House of Representatives. By American standards, our system has woefully insufficient checks and balances, and it should immediately become a fascist dictatorship. Somehow or other it doesn't seem to, but there you go. But yes, some form of representative democracy, because so far nobody can do a direct democracy with any success that I can see.
Well, I think we've lost Elgin again.
I think we have.
I would hazard a guess, and a true democracy is going to have a maximum growth.
Yes.
That is, you get to a point, and technically speaking, the United States doesn't really have a democracy in this, because it's Republican form.
Yeah.
We have representatives. We attempted, for me, the fun part is that in the War of the Rebellion, as it was known in the South, in the Civil War, the Confederacy went back to the Confederacy model that was used prior to the Constitution.
Yeah.
And found that it didn't work. You know, they were arguing for a confederacy of states where each state was unique.
Mm-hmm.
That was, you know, the early government model for the whole country, and it didn't work.
Yes.
The whole model that they were trying to preserve. Now, I'm not going to get into what was there before the Civil War. I'm looking at the model, and Jefferson Davis trying to get the various governors to give him the resources so he can get, you know, get the armies provided. And they are, you know, what I'm saying, Elgin, is that I have in my own mind that a true democracy has a limit of size.
I would say, I would rephrase that slightly and say a direct democracy has a limited size.
Okay, I can accept that.
Yeah, I would argue that that's one of the reasons the republic system works so well, because the closer you get to the people, the more direct the democracy becomes. Yeah. And you end up pushing, I think one of the big problems right now is we push power up to Washington in the states such that individuals have very little say over what happens in their lives, as opposed to pushing the power down to the local communities where they have much more of a say.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with you on that, Elgin. I'm very much in favour of localism, a principle which Europe describes as subsidiarity, a movement of power downwards to the most local level possible. The trouble is they talk wonderfully about it, and it doesn't happen. So Europe tends to grab power to itself from the individual national governments, just as the federal government does in the states.
Well, I think this kind of goes back to the whole difference between, you know, the liberal and the conservative, and we see this in economics. If you're going to have a command and control, you have to have power centralized at the top. Mm-hmm. If you're going to have a more market-based, you can decentralize down to the bottom, and that's where, you know, the thing is, if you decentralize, you no longer have the control, and people could do things like gamble in the market, things that you don't think would be as productive. So it's the classic problem of how do you control a society? How do you run the society? If you let people do it themselves, you know, they may make choices you don't like.
Or we can, you know, at some point in time, the technology is going to get to the point where Google Hangouts become the manner of, you know, what we're doing now. I know I interviewed for a job, didn't get the job, darn it. But one of the things was that the students had a clicker so that you could instantaneously, during the class, during the lecture, get feedback on whether or not that information was accepted or understood. And I've heard that bandied about so many times about what we're going to do with the internet.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're seeing it to some extent.
Yeah.
Of course, take Uber. Yeah, take Uber. We talked about it. I mean, not only do the drivers rate, the people rate the drivers rate the clients. Everyone gets rated, and you know, when you have that real-time feedback, the need for a large overseeing government organization to make sure cabs are run right largely disappears.
Yeah, but then you have a problem like what happens when a participatory member of the group keeps dropping out because the technology's not working right.
Well, maybe we're not ready for that yet.
Yeah,
I was talking with someone the other day, and I created in 1992 a collaborative paper with. I was in Minnesota. Martine was in Odessa, Texas, and George was in Melbourne, Australia. And at that time, now I knew Marcin because was in Odessa before I moved to Minnesota. Neither one of us knew George. And as we're getting into the development of this collaborative paper, he disappeared. And we thought, it's a very frightening thing. Here's a guy coming in, and suddenly he disappears, and we don't know why. Turns out, and at the same time, I lost my internet connection on a 24-hour rebuild. They took the system down, and they didn't tell anybody. His system went down at the same time my system went down. So there's still some problems with the technology.
Yep.
And ultimately, I didn't meet George. He does exist.
Well, I knew Henry for about 10 years before I actually met him.
Yeah.
Henry's the publisher of Energeon, so.
Yeah. But the technology's there. We can begin to develop the true representative democracy. But at the same time, we have to encourage, and this is a topic for another time, the technology is going to have to really be built and tested so that, for the lack of a better term, fail-safe. The movie Fail-Safe.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, yeah, we're living at one good solar flare will knock out most everything we've got. So
yeah.
we're kind of building out onto the edge here. Well, we're pretty much out of time for this week. Let me go ahead and give everyone a real quick chance to conclude, and then I'll have some upcoming attractions. Chris, you have any final words?
I've got nothing to add at this point.
Tony?
Just be a good neighbor. That's not an insurance sale. Just be a good neighbor.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, coming up on September 1st on the Energeon Hangouts on Tuesdays, we have congregations. Are they alive or not so much? This is an interview with Dr. Ruth Fletcher, the author of a new release, Thrive, Spiritual Habits of Transforming Congregations. She's a regional minister for the Christian Church in Montana. Has taken the opportunity to observe church alive and those which are not. So join Dr. Fletcher and Henry Neufeld, the publisher. That should be a very interesting and enlightening conversation. Also, we still have the ongoing and growing Energeon discussion groups. Each day during the week, there's a new post put up by one of the Energeon authors, and a lot of active discussion. And as we saw today, you have a chance to win a free book there. Finally, there's going to be Global Christians Perspectives next week, and hopefully my internet connection will be a little bit better by then. Until then, I want to thank you for joining us and hope to see you next week.
Take care. Have a good weekend.
Take care.
Oh, well, this is goodbye from me as well.